So welcome everyone to this session of the Emeritus College Travel Group. And before we get started with the presentation, I want to acknowledge that I live in the unceded, ancestral and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I expect that many of you are also in these territories, but perhaps some of you are elsewhere. Welcome to the session. Today, David Edgington is going to talk to us about rail travel in Africa. And I'm going to hand it over to David and he can introduce himself. And then David, perhaps you can share your screen.
Righto. Can everybody see this?
No, you haven't shared yet.
Okay.
Now we can see you. Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining me today. My name is David Edgington. I'm a Professor Emeritus of Geography. Let me start my presentation with a question. Corky, do you like riding in trains? I do. When I was at school growing up in Bristol, England, I was enthralled by old steam engines that ran along the tracks near where I lived. They would steam east to London and in other directions to major cities such as Birmingham and Gloucester and Exeter. Bristol was a railway hub, and I enjoyed the hobby of train spotting. What is train spotting? Well, it's not just the title of a famous 1990s British movie, but the pastime of many school children and also adults. It involves a British subculture that was popularized in the post-war period based on the spotting of locomotives, recording their numbers and noting particular characteristics of the train engine, such as the size. It became a kind of cult hobby at that time. And it was simulated by a series of books written by a railway employee called Ian Allen, who from the 1940s published listings of all the then known locomotives in Britain, together with their unique number. These books were cheap to buy and they were updated every year. Train spotters used to mark off the loco numbers in the book after a sighting. The books were all wonderful. They were illustrated with wonderful black and white photos of various locomotives. Sadly, the hobby seemed to die out in the 1970s, along with the demise of steam engines in Britain. Anyway, with this personal history, my very first visit to Africa last year involved a 16-day train journey across 5 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Today, I would like to share with you some of my experiences along the way. If you look at the map in the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the route of my journey from Cape Town in South Africa, north to Botswana, then crossing the 2 nations, Zam and Zim, meaning Zambia and Zimbabwe, and finally northeast into Tanzania and the port city of Dar es Salaam, a total of 5,530 kilometers. Along the way, we visited various iconic African locations, such as the Victoria Falls. Here I am at the Victoria Falls, and in about 20 minutes' time, I'll try to explain why. But at the outset, let me say something about train travel for tourists in Africa, or more specifically about the unabashedly very comfortable trip that I went on in September last year. The name of the rail company that transported me and 57 other paying guests across Africa was Rovos Rail. The owner of Rovos Rail is Rohan Vos, hence Rovos Rail. and also his Mrs. Anthea Voss, who are both shown in the left-hand side of this slide. This black and white photo is the only image today that I didn't take myself. It's in the public domain, and it shows an early tourist train ran by Rovos Rail. And if you look very carefully at this photo, you can see that the locomotive here is a steam engine, as the truck behind it is carrying coal. This is a shot from the 1980s. Now to the present. So it happened that myself, together with 57 other paying guests, checked into the Cape Town station on Friday, September the 13th, 2024. The owner of the rail line, Rohan Voss, was there personally to welcome us, and he gave us a short talk about the history of his company. Mr. Voss proudly announced that 2024 was the 30th anniversary of his business for international tourists. And then he told us that his own passion for trains and railway travel began in 1985 when he and his wife Anthea took up a last-minute invitation on a train trip from Cape Town to the South African capital, Pretoria, for his company's business suppliers. Rohan was in the auto repair business at that time. There's a very interesting official history of the company online, and from this I quote the following passage, where Anthea comments on that very first trip back in 1985. Anthea said, "I became a train widow on that day. I sat all dressed up by myself. Rohan spent most of the time in the engine with the driver. The irony was that we should have seen then how difficult running a railroad company would be. The train broke down and we were all bussed back to town." So for the very first time, the Voss family thought about running a railroad company. The train never reached its destination on schedule. This early breakdown, I believe, surely proved prophetic. It foretold structural problems in this type of tourist business, which I will weave into my story very soon. Fast forward many years from the 1980s and across to the right-hand side of my slide here. This is me, David, at the Rovos rail yards near Pretoria. They are called Capital Park. I am in the engineer's cabin of one of the last steam engines in South Africa. It's a 1948 locomotive, engine number 3360, called the Spirit of Africa by Rovos Rail. And in this photo, I'm just about to fulfill a schoolboy dream of pulling the chain and making the railway horn blow loudly. Toot, 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 toot. Mostly to the amusement of the 57 other paying passengers. What did our train look like? All told, our train from Cape Town to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania stretched out along about 600 meters of track. It was comprised of 21 restored carriages, all dating originally from the 1920s and 1930s, together with 2 diesel locomotives and a fuel carriage. On board, there were kitchens and a laundry service. Besides sleeping compartments for the 58 paying guests, there were also sleeping compartments for the train manager and his crew of cleaners, cooks and servers, engineers, as well as 2 Rovos Rail doctors on board for all of our journey. Our manager was a wonderful chap, Mr. Henny Kalitz. Henny told us that he and his Rovos Rail staff make this trip from Cape Town to Dar es Salaam and then back again only 2 times a year. Here is my compartment. Very nicely restored from old wooden carriages that Rohan Voss had bought up in various locations since the 1980s. It was air conditioned, but for me, a real plus was that I could open all the windows. At night, wooden shutters could be raised to block out bright lights to allow for a good night's sleep. Just outside of my room, a narrow, continuous corridor along the train connected these sleeping compartments to the dining cars, which were placed in the center of the train to allow efficient movement to and fro. So in a sense, the Rovos rail journey I took was a kind of movable history. It rolled along with vintage rail cars bought by the company and then retrofitted at the rail yard with modern amenities. Air conditioning, showers, refrigerators, and a comfortable bed. So what did we all do for the 16 days of the trip? Friends of mine in Vancouver who found out that I was taking a rail journey for 2 weeks said, "David, what on earth are you going to do? You had better buy a decent long novel. Have you ever read War and Peace? It's over 1,000 pages long. That should do it." As a result, before leaving Vancouver, I did indeed go out and buy a copy of War and Peace for the trip. And perhaps not surprisingly, I did not get round to read it in Africa. There was just too much else to do, such as just relaxing in my sleeping carriage, watching the world go by. These are shots taken inside the car looking out. We traveled in September at the very end of a long African dry season. Once we had left Cape Town in South Africa's cool coastal regions, the countryside became drier and drier. And as we headed north into the equatorial zone, the temperatures became warmer and warmer. These 2 shots from my digital collection of the trip were taken in Botswana during our traverse of the dry Kalahari Desert. I used to live in Australia, so if I squinted when looking out of my window, I could just imagine kangaroos running alongside the train. Well, not really. The vegetation and the shapes of the distant mountains are quite different from Australia, but the brown and green colors that passed us by were very, very reminiscent. The third photo down below shows that as we went eastward, the country sometimes became greener. Rohan Vos told us about the poorly maintained rail lines in the rural areas of Africa. And this is why a Rovos rail train typically ran very slowly, only about 25 kilometers an hour, about 15 miles an hour. Consequently, the landscapes outside my carriage windows moved by also rather slowly, just like a movie would. Changing landscape after changing landscape. And just like a movie, the landscapes that kept changing always seemed to defeat my meager attempt to capture them for posterity with various digital contraptions. Sometimes we would pass villages located far from any major road. Indeed, there was sometimes no recognizable road at all. And no matter what time of day, there were always children, often running beside the train. The main buzz on the train during the days was, of course, not our individual sleeping cars, but activity in the tea and coffee lounges where I could interact with other travelers. The left-hand shot shows the train's observation car, located at the very end of the 600-meter-long chain. Here, coffee and tea were served in the mornings and afternoons. And the 58 paying passengers, who were these people? I was one of 3 singles. The other were all in couples. Ages ranged from my son's age, about 42 years, to someone who had their 95th birthday on board the train in Africa. People came from many countries: Europe, South Africa, China, the Antipodes, and the USA. There was one other Canadian on board, Terry from Toronto. There were a modicum of doctors and lawyers, but the vast majority, like me, comprised part of what you might call the leisure class. These are folk who were retired and for whom travel, typically by cruise ship, was a very serious hobby. I myself am a very terrible sailor. Anyway, most of the passengers were seasoned travelers, but for the vast majority, like me, this was their very first time in Africa. Conversely, there were absolutely no teenagers on board, mainly because of the cost of the travel, but also because there was absolutely no internet connection for 16 days. On the right, shown in this shot, are some of my newfound friends, each with their own fascinating histories and stories. Facing me is Shelley and her partner Al from the USA. Behind them are Per and Helen from Denmark. Poor Per had real trouble getting to sleep on the train when it was moving at night. And behind them, a family of 3 from New Zealand, Delma, the mother, and 2 sisters, Helen and Sandra. Then right at the back, Alan from the UK and Beat from Germany. We were served 3 meals a day in 2 dining cars. And I'm very glad to say that all our meals were served on time. Breakfast was from 7 o'clock to 10. And then later in the day, a musical gong along the corridor heralded lunch at 1300 hours and dinner at 1930, just after the sun went down. Rovos Rail pitches itself as a luxury rail line and in the good old-fashioned way. Rohan Vos said that he took his inspiration for the company from the romanticism of trains, where in the past people played cards, had a good meal, or made a friend for the journey. The 2 dining cars on our train certainly had the ambience of a fine restaurant. Fine china, fresh cut flowers, and white tablecloths. Somebody asked me, well, what did you eat? Here is a sample from the daily menu given in advance to all the guests. My dishes were all vegetarian. Lunch, spinach and ricotta ravioli with monge tout, green peas, herbed butter and parmesan shavings, lentil and butternut bobotie, the South African dish, with sambal, the sauce. This was followed by drunken pecorino. That turned out to be sheep's cheese with garden leaves and fresh apple, or South African milk tart. And that was just the first day. The chefs on the train all worked small miracles in very small kitchens where temperatures went up and down throughout the journey. There was a very interesting dress code on the train. And here I'm quoting from the Rovos Rail Guide, which we were all sent to beforehand. Page 3, dress code. During the day, this should be neat, meaning conventional, yet relatively informal in style and combining casual and formal clothing pieces. What was this? Certainly not my usual Australian attire for hot, dry places, comprising of a t-shirt, shorts, and flip-flop sandals. Evening attire was even more formal. And again, I'm quoting from the Rovos Rail Guide. For gentlemen, a jacket and tie is a minimum requirement, while for the ladies, we suggest cocktail, evening dress, or suits. Funnily enough, among our groups, there was some confusion as to the correct dress code. Some gentlemen were told by their travel agents in Australia that a tie was good enough, and so they did not bring a jacket. In my case, my Vancouver agent suggested that I brought a jacket, but that no tie was required. So I boarded the train in Cape Town without a tie, but mercifully found that I could buy a bow tie on board the train. And here on the right-hand side of this slide, I'm profiling my Rovos Rail alter ego, all dressed up Rovos Rail style. My name is Bond, David Bond. I am the black sheep of the Bond family. One of my newfound friends on the trip was former Admiral John Wesley Noble from the United States. He fought in the Korean War, and he was very glad to see me wearing a bow tie. On the first evening, he told me, "David, the staff are all wearing formal attire. They're doing their part. We should do ours." He was very old school. And this was the gent who celebrated his 95th birthday on board the train. Certainly no mean feat. Okay. The Rovos Rail trip also included lectures from an onboard academic. In our case, this was historian Nicholas Southey. He's shown standing up on the left-hand photo, who is from the University of South Africa. And he gave an array of very interesting talks about South Saharan and the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa. These included examining what were the lasting legacies of European missionaries and explorers such as David Livingstone, as well as 19th century business people such as Cecil Rhodes, the entrepreneur and imperialist who had a great dream of connecting the entire continent by both rail and telegraph. Nicholas, the historian, was also very knowledgeable about recent historic events in sub-Saharan Africa, and he told us about the evolving political and economic conditions in the countries and regions the train passed through. After dinner, the paying guests, should they want, could enjoy conversation and learn about each other, as well as discuss the day's events in the observation carriage, which in the evenings was converted into a bar. So Rovos Rail certainly lived up to its promise of very good service on board, with well-appointed rail cars, good food and wine. One aspect of that service was a forecast of the following day's weather and temperatures provided by our dedicated carriage hosts. The toy baboon shown here is called Cornelius. Cornelius was a present I gave to my 3-year-old grandson Jude when I returned to Vancouver, together with a photo montage of all of Cornelius's adventures in Africa. If you look hard, you can see the 24th of September weather forecast that Cornelius is holding. The days started to start off cool, but became warm by the afternoon. So where did Cornelius go on this particular train journey? Let's find out. The map shows the route in more detail. We started off in Cape Town in the southwest and then snaked our way through South Africa, arriving 16 days later in Dar es Salaam on the coast of Tanzania. While the standard of service on the train was excellent and the locomotives were all well maintained, a major flaw in the business model was that Rovos Rail could not completely control the quality of the tracks. Consequently, the train's official schedule for the 16 days, which was handed out to all paying guests beforehand, was rarely met. The paying guests soon talked about the difference between real time and Rovos time. On day 1, Friday the 13th, we departed Cape Town on time. So far, so good. Then on that very first night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard a very loud bang, which was extremely loud and incredibly close, and which brought the train to a screeching halt. What could it be? My compartment hostess was called Summer, Miss Summer Krukomp. She knocked on my carriage door in the morning and said, "Oh, Mr. David, you may have noticed we haven't moved for several hours." At breakfast, when the passengers assembled, the train manager, Henny Kalitz, explained to everyone that someone had stolen the metal from the overhead cable and the wires and the other equipment that you often see on electrified railway lines. So, sadly, because of poverty in South Africa, especially the desperation of poor people outside of the big cities, the train manager told me that this type of event was not totally uncommon. Eventually, a rescue train from Cape Town turned up, bringing heavy equipment and a repair crew. Much later on the same day, several hours now behind the published schedule, we rumbled into Fontaine Station, about 250 kilometers northeast of Cape Town. And here we had time for a late afternoon stroll through what is a historic small railway settlement. Fontaine in Afrikaans can be translated as sage fountain in English. This place has had a history as a rail resort since the 19th century, along the lines of the historic CPR Banff Springs Hotel. Today, Fontaine has a full-time population of just 400 people. Of special interest to the visitors was a museum on the platform and a collection of historic auto cars and railway carriages, and an eclectic 19th century Dutch-style architecture of various houses, hotels and restaurants, shown in the left-hand side of my slide. On day 3, still on tracks maintained by South African Railways, we were now a more serious 10 hours behind schedule, and sadly we missed out on the programmed visit to the Kimberley diamond mine. I was disappointed, as diamonds play an important role in South Africa's economy, both historically and currently. No chance for me to buy a diamond. On day 4, we arrived at Potchefstroom Station, which is southeast of Pretoria, the nation's capital. And now we are an even more serious 14 hours behind the printed schedule. A decision was made by the train manager that we travel into Pretoria by coach, bypassing Johannesburg, South Africa's largest city, while the train would eventually catch up and meet us. We all boarded 2 coaches and arrived 2 hours later for a tour of the Rovos rail yards, Capital Park. We were given lunch and then a fascinating inspection of the station and the rail yard facilities. And that was where you saw me pull the whistle cord on locomotive 3360, the spirit of Africa. By coach, we then made another 2-hour trip to Pretoria itself, the nation's administrative capital. Cape Town is the parliamentary capital of South Africa. On our coach tour of Pretoria, we saw this 9-giant-meter bronze statue of Nelson Mandela that stands below the Union Buildings, South Africa's seat of government. Nelson Mandela, you will remember, was the first democratically elected president of South Africa. The dates are 1994 to 1999, and this statue was just over 10 years old. Nicholas, the onboard historian, talked about Mandela's history and his legacy. He said, similar to China's Mao Zedong, Nicholas thought that Mandela's legacy was 70% good and 30% bad, mainly due to the inability of his African National Congress, the ANC government in the 1990s, to deal with both the HIV/AIDS pandemic as well as the high levels of poverty in South Africa. Well, with the sun going down on a long day, we then took another 2 hours to get back to the Potchefstroom station and board the train. The train hadn't gone anywhere. Everyone was very tired and hungry that day, and for obvious reasons, evening dinner was informal, no dressing up. On the South African leg of our journey, our final hop off the train was on day 5 when we visited the Midikawe Game Reserve. This is a 75,000-kilometer game reserve lying in South Africa, but very close to the border with Botswana to the north. We were told the word Midikawe means place of blood, referring to the many battles between the Zulu invaders and local tribes in the 1820s. The game reserve itself was established in 1992 and involved the massive relocation of about 8,000 head of game from unprotected areas to the reserve by the South African regional government. So in a sense, this is an artificial game reserve. All the animals here were brought in from the African bush for protection against poachers. There are over 350 bird species and over 60 mammal species here, including all the big five majestic beasts: lions, elephants, buffaloes, black rhinoceros, and leopards, and also the endangered white rhinoceros. In addition, the Middelkalwe Reserve has the so-called ugly five. What are these? The warthog, the wildebeest, vultures, and the Marabou stork. During the dry season in Africa, this reserve boasts an artificially replenished waterhole filled by water pumped from an underground natural reservoir. The photo on the left shows what greeted my early morning view just outside of the reserve's lodge on day 7, when a herd of wildebeest, also called gnu, visited the waterhole. At this point, I remembered the famous Flanders and Swan music hall song from the 1950s in the United Kingdom. I'm a gnu, who are you? The lyrics are very funny, and they include these lines. I'm a gnu, the nicest work of nature in the zoo. I'm a gnu, how do you do? You really ought to know who's who. I'm a gnu, spelled GNU. I'm not a camel or a kangaroo. So let me introduce, I'm neither man or moose. Oh, gno, I'm a gnu. It was a hit song at the time. On that morning, after half an hour or so, this herd of gnu appeared to have enough to drink, and they disappeared back into the bush. Later in the day, we were able to enjoy a game ride through the reserve. And among other splendid beasts, we saw a pride of lions resting in the bush in the late afternoon, shown here on the right-hand side. Lions, like cats everywhere, seem to sleep all day, until they don't, of course. The rail journey then continued northward through Botswana and Zimbabwe to the Victoria Falls. We had an overnight stay at the historic Victoria Falls Hotel. The hotel shown on the left itself is huge. It dates from 1905 and it has a distinct architecture and a very fine set of old pictures and paintings of the falls and the immediate region. So why is there a railway station and bridge at the Victoria Falls? I said earlier I would try to explain. Cecil Rhodes, who had a very mixed legacy, named this region Rhodesia. He dreamed of a railway connecting Cape Hope north to Cairo, and it was his vision that inspired the construction of both the Victoria Falls Bridge, seen here across the Zambezi River, and also the railway line up from South Africa. The railway was strategically placed here to make the Victoria Falls accessible to tourists. And together with the station, the Victoria Falls Hotel was built around the same time to accommodate the influx of visitors. Today, the railway provides a crucial link between Zambia and Zimbabwe, as well as connecting this very remote area to railways in other parts of Southern Africa. The Victoria Falls Bridge is therefore a key part of this network. The left-hand slide shows a painting of the bridge hung up in the Victoria Falls Hotel. You can see that the bridge lies some distance from the hotel itself. But if you look very carefully at the landscape, you can see the distinctive red brick roof tiles of the hotel in the background. And if you have exceptionally good eyesight, you should be able to pick out a train and the Victoria Falls station. The bridge was built by British engineers in 1904 at a dizzying height of 130 meters. On day 10, we were told that there was a variety of activities to participate in. Mr. David, did I want to go bungee jumping off the falls? Did I want to zip line across the gorge? Did I want to go whitewater rafting in the Zambezi River? Cornelius and I settled for a 20-minute helicopter ride over the falls in the surrounding area. My very first helicopter ride. I sat next to the driver, pilot, whose name was Lucky. Lucky had very sharp eyes and he could pick out elephants hundreds of meters below in the treeless savanna plains. At their deepest, the Victoria Falls are around 108-meter vertical drop, about twice as high as Niagara. When I visited the dry season last September, it was the low water season in the Zambezi River that feeds the falls. The falls themselves became almost completely dry of water, exposing the rock of the gorge, as you can see here from the shot I took on the helicopter flight. The Victoria Falls are simply the single longest waterfall in the world. On the other side of the world, the Iguaça Falls, on the border between Brazil and Argentina, comprise the largest series of falls in the world. Our little group concluded its overnight stay at the Victoria Falls Hotel with a late afternoon boat ride along the Zambezi River north of the falls themselves, taking in a spectacular African sunset. We saw hippos and crocodiles and colorful birds. There are elephants along the riverbank in this left-hand side photo. The Zambezi River at this point provides a natural boundary between Zambia in the northeast and in Zimbabwe in the south and west. In this part of Africa in September, it was now very hot and humid outside, about 35 degrees in the daytime. All the rail tracks along the 5,000 kilometers of our journey were known by our rail crew by the names the good, the bad, and the ugly. The ugly was the rail track through Zimbabwe, formerly called Rhodesia, which was the very worst maintained. Nicholas, the historian, blamed the ineptitude of the post-colonial government of Robert Mugabe. For instance, Zimbabwe's passenger rail system had long since completely shut down. He said it was a sign of a decaying economy under the country's authoritarian government. On day 11, we started our journey north again past the Victoria Falls and onward through Zambia, formerly called Northern Rhodesia. We continued to roll along, though at a much reduced speed of just 15 kilometers an hour, almost the same speed as a fast runner. On this day, because of the poor quality of the tracks, the train lurched from side to side like a ship in a storm. Things started to look up on day 12 when we joined the good track, which belonged to the Tanzania-Zambia Railway Authority, popularly known as TAZARA. Are there any railway buffs in the audience? The TAZARA line is a binational railway. It links the Southern African Regional Transport Network to East Africa's seaport at Dar es Salaam, our final destination. The rail line offers both freight and passenger transportation services between and within Tanzania and Zambia. Nicholas, the historian, opined that while it had never been profitable, it did provide an important communication link between the various small communities along its tracks, who otherwise would be quite isolated. The TAZARA rail line runs for a total of 1,800 kilometers, and it was built in the 1970s by the Chinese government to promote unity with the newly independent and socialist countries of Zambia and Tanzania. So the TAZARA line was conceived to provide a critical outlet to the sea that landlocked Zambia then needed for its important copper exports, in order to break free from its dependency on Rhodesia, Angola, and South African rails and ports. The TAZARA rail project is an interesting transnational as well as a Pan-African project. In the 1970s, it was intended to serve as a symbol of revolutionary third world solidarity and resistance to the forces of colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. Today, most of Zambia's copper reaches the coast by truck. But it stands as a very important engineering feat. The rail line snakes through 23 tunnels and many bridges. The longest tunnel was about 1 kilometer. The final stops for Rovos rail passengers along this journey comprised very interesting rail towns in Tanzania, Kasama and Makambako. These are both small towns that dramatically expanded following the completion of the Tazara line in the 1970s. We had no tourist program in these towns, just a stop off, offering a glimpse of everyday life. For instance, in the left-hand photos, there are some of the street markets that I saw. But what about these very strange 8-foot tall red kiosks on the right? What do you think they are? Are they porta potties? No. Are they ATMs? No. They are banking kiosks. And who would have guessed in small town Africa? Evidently, local African banks cannot afford to build bricks and mortar retail banks these days. But due to the marvel of iPhones, digital technology, local workers and merchants can send and receive funds from anywhere using these kiosks. So it's an interesting example of high technology micro banking in rural Africa. I saw them as a small symbol of hope for the future. Indeed, a famous Roman philosopher, Pliny the Elder, once said, "Out of Africa, always something new." After joining the Tazara line, we climbed into the Kipengeri Ranges. These were much greener than the dry lands we passed through in Botswana further south. And the landscapes outside my carriage changed and changed yet again. I have no particular aspirations to be a great photographer. I am always in awe at the wonderful photos taken by folk in Paul's travel specialty group, showing their own travels through Africa, India, and elsewhere. Africa certainly affected me in many, many ways. The kindness of local people who I met later on in the Serengeti in Zanzibar, who live in villages and who basically have nothing. The majesty of the animals, the color and songs of African bird life. And I just fell in love with African music of all types. But it was the shapes of Africa's many iconic trees that also impressed. I photographed this baobab tree from my carriage when the train was crossing Tanzania. These very attractive and distinctive looking trees grow in many sub-Saharan African countries. The baobab tree is particularly known for its massive trunks and longevity. They can live for up to 5,000 years, we were told, reach up to 30 meters high and up to an enormous 50 meters in circumference. Baobab trees provide shelter, food, and water for animals and humans, which is why many savanna communities in Africa on treeless plains make their homes near baobab trees. Back to the train ride. On day 13, one of our 2 locomotives derailed an axle, and this was on the good Tazara line. And more importantly, because we derailed in a very remote place, we became delayed by 12 hours before a rescue train could reach us and send us on our way. And because of this delay, we missed out completely on a scheduled visit to another game reserve, the Nyeri National Park in Tanzania, which is one of the very largest in Africa. Many of the 58 paying guests were notably displeased and annoyed. And so it came on day 15 to the very last evening. Rovos Rail pulled out all the stops and put on a 1920s themed party for the paying guests. Many of the ladies wore flapper outfits, and many gentlemen dressed in suspenders with oil and slick-backed hair. And as befits the last night of an epic journey, the paying passengers organized an international talent show. And the show was emceed by a character called David Bond, me. We had a lovely time. The Chinese group of 4 from Shanghai sang The East is Red. An American PhD in economics made up a song called Off the Rails about our journey. An Irish couple sang Molly Malone, and the 3 New Zealand ladies did a Maori ceremonial dance, the haka. My own contribution was a song from the 1960s by good old Pete Seeger, Whim Away, the Lion Sleeps Tonight. Paul is now telling me that we are running out of time, so I'm not going to sing it for you today if I'm to keep to my own published schedule. Sadly, all things good must come to an end. The following morning, after a race to the finish, the Pride of Africa stormed into Dar es Salaam railway station, more or less on time, for which I was personally very, very grateful. Some of the 58 paying guests flew out of Africa the next day, either back to Europe or to the US or to Australia and New Zealand. Others, like me, continued their African journey with a visit to the nearby Serengeti Game Reserve for another photo safari. This shot is not of Dar es Salaam rail station, but it gives a sense of the passengers milling around outside the train. And what about the train crew that we passengers said goodbye to and then left behind? I know that after a 48-hour layover in Dar es Salaam, all the crew, including the train manager Henny and historian Nicholas, had then to prepare the train for the 16-day journey back to Cape Town with another group of paying guests. Just a final couple of comments to wrap up. First, this 16-day journey reminded me why I like long-distance train travel. I've made other train trips, mainly in Australia. And then I remembered the advice of Rohan Vos at the very beginning of our journey. He said, "This is Africa. We never know what lies ahead." We traversed 5 countries, each with different requirements and rail authorities. And as we found out, there can be a few surprises. So I'll leave it there. But if you're a friend of mine, please remind me never to buy a railroad company in Africa. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, David. What a beautifully presented talk. It was certainly very interesting. And I'd ask you, you've stopped sharing. I'm going to put this now on my gallery view and see if anyone would like to comment or ask questions.
Yeah.
Dawn.
David, I assume it was an electric train, was it?
It was diesel.
It's diesel.
But we had electricity from overhead and also a generator.
Okay.
Rohan Vos told us that steam engine rail went on through the 1990s, and then it became gradually harder and harder to keep going.
Have anyone else done such a train ride through Africa?
You want to ask your question.
Yep.
So you can go ahead.
But we're
Oh.
on mute.
No,
Yes.
I took it off.
Yes, you can talk.
Hi there. Thanks for a wonderful show there. How about making stops to look around? Did you do that?
It was a very tightly controlled, scheduled trip. Sadly, when we went to stations, sometimes we'd have to take on water. Sometimes we'd have to change the crew. From time to time, local pilots, these are train engineers who really know the local track, when to speed up, when to slow down, they were taken on. Some people have asked me about safety and security. Remember I said you could open all the windows, and that was a great plus for me. So we had special goggles where we could peer outside. But at the railway stations, we were emphatically told by the staff, please make sure your windows are shut and the shutters are up. The temptation of putting a hand in or even climbing into a carriage is often too great. And even animals. I don't know if you saw the film Gladiator 2. Baboons can be incredibly aggressive. So Rovos didn't want baboons coming into the carriage.
Well, I had the experience when I was in Zambia, staying at a different place close to on the Zambezi River, that we went out to visit the falls one day and came back to find monkeys inside our place. And they had turned on the taps of water, and they hadn't quite made a major mess. But from then on, we had to make sure that when we left, we closed all the windows.
Right. That's the right thing to do. Otherwise, I mean, I felt very safe. The train crew were trained to look after us very well. At this point, somebody usually asks, well, how much did this trip cost? And I have to say, train spotting is a lot cheaper.
Well, are you going to enlighten us? How much does it cost?
Rovos Rail charged me $20,000 US.
Wow. So
Traveling as a single is always more expensive, eh? If you travel as a single, you have to incur a little bit more. My son, the 42-year-old Stephen, he was going to come with me, but last year he decided he wanted to get married. So he said, Dad, I need to save my cash for home repairs. These young people.
You know, Peter, you have been into rail travel, Peter Wing. Did you want to say anything? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, there we go. We have traveled by train, but not on quite such a grand scale. Although you brought back one memory when we were in Australia, we took the train from Sydney to Adelaide and woke up in the morning looking out of the window with it seemed like hundreds of kangaroos all hopping across at about the same speed we were going. So that's quite something to see. Otherwise, our distance of trains, I guess we did.
We did it in China.
We did a couple of 1.5 day trips. Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to think of longer ones.
We had done one before that from New Delhi to Sikkim.
That was 36 hours.
It was about 36 hours, and there were four of us, two couples in this car, which is nice. We had a bit of a snack at one point, and this one I remember, and we put the snack.
We had the snack before we got on the train.
We had the snack before we got on the train, but we had a little left over, so there's a little shelf by the window, so we put it on that. And in the morning, it had been more or less devoured by all the ants that were inside the box. So I guess those trains are fairly well populated. I'm not sure if you meant anything like that.
It was relatively hermetically sealed and air conditioned.
I guess the air conditioning does it.
Was excellent.
Yeah, if you're all around in September, Peter and I are going to talk about our trip in Sri Lanka. Where was it? And part of that trip was in southern India, where we took 2 overnight train trips in Indian trains, and they costed I think the total accommodation and travel costs for the 2 of us was under $30, so quite a bit cheaper than what you paid. But we've got the video footage of what it was like on that train, and we will share it in September.
And the interesting part of that was actually negotiating the computer system of the Indian Railway, which we'll also release at that time.
Sounds wonderful.
David, would they run it more often if they could get more customers? Why only twice a year?
It must be some special arrangement with the rail authorities. And I think putting the train together is no mean feat. They had a strange booking system that they tended to overbook the year before I went. So that's when I started to become interested. And I was hanging on for a cancellation, which finally came through about February, March last year. So that's when I paid my deposit and I knew that I was set for this journey. It's not a regular rail journey. It is expensive, and that demand and supply carries out to just twice a year. They do very interesting other, maybe shorter trips. There's an east-west one through Namibia. That sounds very interesting. Maybe my next, we'll see.
Helen?
Oh, thank you very much, David. I really enjoyed that. And it reminded me of how our wonderful trip to Botswana and our flight in a helicopter over Victoria Falls and the baobab trees and the animals and camping. And it was just such a rich and rewarding place to be. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Africa was, I'm still trying to work it out. You have luxury next door to desperate poor people. What can you do as an individual? Put money in the donations jar. The helicopter flight was raising funds for a local school, and that seemed very, very useful. Rohan Vos, his company, after 30 years, he's built it up to I think 500 people. So he's a successful small business person.
Richard had an experience in the Victoria Falls, which maybe he would like to tell you about what happened to his camera. Do you remember, Richard?
I do. I had my camera in a Ziploc bag because when we were there, it was a high river flow. It was like walking through a rainforest.
Wow.
Unfortunately, the plastic bag had something coming out of it through the enclosure, and water ran into the bag through this gap. And I wasn't really, I had another camera, so I wasn't really using this one. And then when I finally looked at it, the thought that came to mind was, as a child carrying home a pet fish in a bag of water, the camera was totally submerged. So we were staying in Zimbabwe, so I went back to the place we were staying at and I put it in the sun. And the camera, which was a Canon, kept sending me little messages like, I can't work just now, but I'm working on it. And it got better and better. And finally it said, everything is good. And I came to the conclusion that, far from being a negative, this had actually washed the camera inside and out. And it ended up in better shape than it was initially. But on the other hand, I wouldn't want to recommend this because it may not work that way on every occasion.
Well, the thing that were coming out of the bag, Richard, was the strap for the camera. You had it around your neck.
Oh yeah, that's correct. It was the camera strap, and I had the bag over the camera and the strap. You're right, and the water ran down. Anyway, the bag filled with water, which was not the plan, but it turned out it worked out quite. Took about 24 hours for the camera to fully revive itself, along with these encouraging messages from time to time.
A smart camera.
It was before the days of AI, so I'm still perplexed as to what it was doing, but it seemed to know what it was.
David, how did you organize the trip from here, from Vancouver?
North-south travel can do just about everything, I think. They have a specialist, Anne Bird is her name. And she was in contact. We had a bit of a wait over several months for me to get a late cancellation. And she said, oh, you're going to Dar es Salaam. You're so close to the Serengeti Reserve. We should book you for a week in the reserve to see game and take more photos. And then she said, oh, David, you know what? You'll be so tired after the 2-week train journey and the week going around by jeep on the safari in the Serengeti. You need a week on the beach in Zanzibar.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I did, which was great.
Oh. Well, again, thanks so much, David. It was a wonderful presentation. The next session will be in June. I will be giving a talk then. It's June the 19th. And I'm going to talk about a trip that took us around the whole of Iceland and then popped over to Greenland for a couple of days.
Wow.
So that will be in June. We do have something this year for presentation in July, which we don't usually do, and that's listed on the website. And then we start back again after summer in September. I'm always looking for people to present. And so if anyone here or is interested in giving a presentation, just give me a shout by email. We can talk about timing and what you would like to talk about. Yeah, again, thank you very much, David.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Paul, for organizing us all.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.